Hello there, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. As we prepare for the release of Andor, which comes in like a month, we've been talking a lot about the Empire's hearts and minds strategy. And no, it does not involve Palpatine and Vader exploding the hearts and minds of their subjects with the Force. Hearts and minds is actually a counterinsurgency strategy commonly used by an occupying military force in an effort to pacify dissidents and generate popular support amongst the population. Contrary to popular belief, the Empire wasn't always cartoonishly evil in how it dealt with the population, especially before things escalated after the raid on Aldhani, and of course the Battle of Yavin. Your treatment and experience under Imperial rule greatly depended on what time period it was and what value your planet had to the Empire. Corewards planets like Bardos were given special privileges. This was a planet that was covered in training facilities and military bases, and a high percentage of the local population served in the Imperial military. Many made it into the special forces as well. On Vardos, the people are actually the important commodity. They were extremely loyal to the Empire, and this is why they were treated relatively well. There was very little friction between the populace and the central government. But then you have the planet of Ryloth, which was predominantly inhabited by the Twi'lek. Its population had been exploited for centuries by various criminal cartels in the region. The Empire was only really interested in the spice on the planet along with the plentiful cheap labor. The relationship between security forces and Twi'leks on Ryloth was far more fraught with tension. The cultural differences were just the beginning of the problems. When the Empire's true intent was revealed, a strong resistance movement started fighting back. In some cases, like on Ryloth, the Empire covered up their actions so the rest of the galaxy didn't witness what was actually going on. The Empire did the same thing on Mimbum, where full-out trench warfare was happening. And that's because in the earlier days of Imperial rule, the Empire still cared somewhat about what their subjects thought about them. There were still concerted efforts to reach the hearts and minds of the average citizen and make them loyal to Palpatine's mission. Hearts and minds is a word that a lot of Americans probably recognize. It has been a part of our military's counterinsurgency doctrine since the Vietnam War. Original credit for the word goes to French Army General Hubert Lata. He coined the term hearts and minds when describing a strategy he used to counter the Black Flags rebellion that threatened the French protectorate in the late 1800s in a little place called Indochina, which is also known as Vietnam today. So that ill-fated little excursion we went on in the 60s, well, that was at the end of about a century-long occupation by the French. And so the Vietnamese were not amateurs at fighting at this point. They were hardened warriors, guerrilla fighters. Critics of the hearts and minds strategy will just point out that the real solution here is just don't occupy a foreign country. But sometimes when you already invaded a country like Vietnam, you can't just immediately pull out. That's embarrassing. You gotta try some things out, and that's what happened. American hearts and minds tactics employed in Vietnam were mostly focused on propping up the South Vietnamese regime and bringing back some sense of normalcy to population centers all across Vietnam and in various hamlets and villages that were constantly being raided. If you take a look at Vietnam, it's a very long and skinny country, and the north and south are geographically isolated from one another. The problem is you have very porous borders to the west of Vietnam. You have Laos and Cambodia, and it's very common for Viet Cong, even North Vietnamese army troops to use those neighboring countries to move freely, basically north and south. Even areas in the deep south where conventional North Vietnamese military units couldn't really reach, there were still plenty of Viet Cong insurgent cells creating chaos. U.S. forces would clear a village during the day, basically question the locals, clear out any weapons caches they might find, deliver aid, maybe hand out some treats. And then at nighttime, they would leave, and the VC would come back and basically take over the village, restock their supplies. They might even punish and kill individuals who have collaborated with American forces. This is a huge problem. This made attempts to stabilize the South very difficult. I mean, a lot of Vietnamese villages were just like, well, you can't protect us from anything. You and the South Vietnamese, you guys are useless. Any of you grunts who served in the global war on terror might have experienced similar things in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so one way the Hearts and Minds campaign was carried out was through what was known as Civilian Irregular Defense Groups, CIDG. This was originally a CIA operation that used Green Berets. The Green Berets specialize in foreign internal defense. That's basically when we go to a war zone or a hostile country, find some kind of allied group that is willing to fight either for American interests or have interests that are aligned with us. This is exactly what Obi-Wan Kenobi, Anakin Skywalker, and Ahsoka do during the Onderonian Civil War in the midst of the Clone Wars. They travel to Onderon in secrecy, and they train local guerrillas or partisans, led by Saw Gerrera in how to fight in asymmetrical warfare. And so those Jedi were acting exactly like how the Green Beret do, and in all fairness, Saw Gerrera acts a lot like these foreign allies we trained. Initially they're good, and then we lose control of them, and then what you end up having is a very deadly cell of fighters who create chaos everywhere. So anyway, these Civilian Irregular Defense Group, or CIDG teams, usually consisted of 5 Special Force soldiers, and they would embed in a Vietnamese hamlet. So during the day, these soldiers would help the local farmers irrigate fields, build fences for the livestock, maybe provide medical support to individuals in the village. You gotta remember, the US military might have more resources at its fire bases in the local area than the local government will. I mean, Vietnam was not a very developed country when we invaded it. I mean, it had been at war for basically 100 years against the French. So these men would also help fortify the village from raids and also train the military-aged men from these hamlets in how to defend themselves. It should be mentioned that a lot of these villages were in the Central Highland, and they were made up of indigenous groups that didn't trust the North or the South. So in a lot of ways, they saw the Americans as an outside party that they could potentially benefit from if they ally with them. In return, these trained villagers would actually go on night patrols with these military advisors, establishing a security buffer around the village that would basically block any kind of VC activity from occurring. This is actually a really successful program, and it essentially eliminated VC influence in the Central Highlands and where these CIDG teams were located. Unfortunately, these kind of operations are very complicated. They're not easy to pull off. Generally speaking, CIDG units are not what the military is good at. I mean, these are CIA advisors with Green Berets underneath their command. They have to be very, very flexible, and they have to be able to operate independently for weeks, months at a time. And again, the military does not like having a large number of these type of units roaming around the countryside of a foreign civil war. And these weren't just any normal soldier. I mean, they really had the right type of mindset, the right education and training, and perhaps most importantly, the right amount of discipline. You might not want McNamara's special guys deploying on month-long embeds in Vietnamese villages. God knows what might happen if you don't have properly trained people carrying out these type of joint operations. Now, the hearts and minds strategy utilized by American forces during Vietnam was heavily studied by the American military leadership, and it was actually something they referenced during the war in Iraq, and perhaps even more importantly, Afghanistan. The United States faced a very similar problem in these areas. You have a very weak regime that is propped up by the American forces, and you're fighting against a very hardened and well-motivated indigenous insurgency, usually from the Taliban, or in Iraq it was more like Sunni militants, Ba'athis, a lot of local groups that had a lot to fight for and really understood the local terrain and culture. Individuals like Stanley A. McChrystal, who at one point led all ISAF and U.S. forces in Afghanistan, had studied the Vietnam-era CIDG doctrine and was a strong believer that a hearts and minds campaign was the only way to stabilize the situation. And in hindsight, it seems like he was really the only one with a plan to actually win this conflict. The only problem is, I don't think it was a conflict we were supposed to win, or that we had the stomach to win. And as you'll see, McChrystal's plan involved a huge ramping up of personnel. And a surge of troops in 2009 was just not something that the Obama administration at the time wanted. I think Americans were growing tired of conflict and war and wanted things to be pulled back somewhat. I really think that what the CIDG did during Vietnam was incredibly important and also gave us some insight in how these type of operations can be carried out. But again, it's really just not practical to roll these type of operations out in larger scale. I mean, during the Vietnam War, there were like maybe a dozen CIDG units. They did train multiple villages each, but again, really small scale type of operation. Plus, in America, democracies get war fatigue quite quickly, especially when the populace doesn't even understand why we're over there. And so these type of hearts and mind, kind of strategies just aren't practical. So anyway, back to Star Wars. Obviously, the Galactic Empire is in quite a different situation from the United States when it comes to their own hearts and minds strategies. I would say that they have a lot of advantages. that the US does not. The United States was partaking in regime change conflicts or civil wars. It was always seen as a foreign and outside entity. The Empire is trying to reintroduce itself to former Republic worlds and any new planets that have been occupied in the Empire's new expansion efforts. The Empire is also the sole sovereign power in the galaxy, and after consolidating all political power into his executive branch, Palpatine has become the absolute ruler of the galaxy. There's also no galaxy-wide resistance movement in the first decade of Imperial rule, and so the Imperial forces are not dealing with, VC or Taliban level insurgencies until much later on. For the most part, in the beginning, it's just local dissidents and criminal groups that they can easily destroy. And on a lot of worlds, just by simply pacifying those criminal elements, it was enough to win over the local populace's hearts and minds. Take a look at a planet like Ganthel, an industrial world in the core that was just overrun with slavers and spice traders. It was a very difficult place to live, very dangerous. When the Empire came, they dismantled the entire criminal underground and stabilize the planet. They would win the loyalty of Imperial subjects like Ray Sloan, who would join the Imperial Navy after seeing how successful their anti-crime operations on her home planet were. She would rise up in the ranks and serve the Empire very well. But on other worlds, the Empire came and they had nothing that the locals wanted, like on Aldhani. This is a sparsely populated planet in the Outer Rim in the Kedemimu sector. Aldhani was chosen by the Imperial High Command as a location for several military bases solely because of its geographical location. The planet had easy access to every part of the sector, and so the Empire wanted to place a credit depository there that would basically hold the payroll for the entire sector. Because of their quick expansion, the Imperial military oftentimes carried out rush strategies like this that were not specifically tailored to the individual situations they were facing. Aldhani, for instance, wasn't a great planet for an Imperial base. It was sparsely populated. It didn't have any existing infrastructure for an Imperial force, and so they had to build everything from the ground up. Furthermore, the indigenous population was spread out in hundreds of tribes across the planet, and they were very spiritual, and they made pilgrimages from the lowlands to the highlands where most of the Imperial facilities were. And so what the Empire thought was a perfect location for their new credit depository was actually in a valley that was very holy to the local Aldhani people. Now, obviously, the best hearts and minds strategy is to just not build your base on a holy site, but it seems like the individuals who designed this base, including the architect, came from Coruscant. And so it's really up to the local garrison commander, Commandant J-Hull Behaz, to come up with a solution. And to his credit, he does come up with a non-confrontational plan. So he ends up building a large enterprise zone in the lowlands that has industrial manufacturing jobs and housing for the local Aldhani people. The Empire, by its nature, seeks to control and dominate the local population of any area because of security reasons. This means an entire planet full of tribal groups that are strewn across the landscape is a no-go. The Empire wants all of them to be moved into one place. With limited resources available, the Empire liked the idea of placing everyone in one area where they can all be monitored. The Empire believed that by providing cheap jobs and cheap terrible housing for these indigenous people, they were actually improving the lives of the locals. But again, the Imperials are kind of arrogant. They don't really try to understand the local culture or what's actually going on.
The Danis, they're simple people. They breed a sad combination of traits that make them particularly vulnerable to manipulation. On a practical level, they have great difficulty holding multiple ideas simultaneously.
The Commandant is very arrogant, and you'll see this a lot with the Imperial leadership in these kind of situations. They just don't really seem to understand how much of a problem they're creating with their actions.
We found the best way to steer them as we like is to offer alternatives. You put a number of options on the table, and they're so wrapped up in choosing they fail to notice you've given them nothing they thought they wanted at the start.
What Behaz perceives as dullness or stupidity is probably just pragmatism. The local leaders don't like their situation, but open revolt against a hyper-militaristic and technologically advanced group of off-worlders isn't really a good idea. By not being openly confrontational and pretending to respect the locals, we have to give the Commandant some credit here. He does seem somewhat aligned to this goal of convincing the locals that the Imperial presence is beneficial. And he doesn't do anything that crazy outright that would make it hard for the local leaders to control the more vibrant and angry youth in their ranks. We have to also consider that aspect, right? You have leaders on the other side who aren't necessarily always going to try to revolt. They might be more aligned with the Empire than you would think, especially if prosperity and stability can be achieved, right? You're going to want to work with these type of leaders instead of hurting them. The problem with Behaz is that although he is working with them, he's just, again, very arrogant, and he underestimates these people greatly.
Their deeper problem is pride. The Danis would rather lose. They'd rather suffer than accept. Which is wildly ironic, because they basically choked down everything we've thrown at them these last 12 years.
Had Behaz actually had a little more empathy and understood what was going on, he'd realize that he was slowly losing control of everything. Local tribal leaders were smiling at him through gritted teeth. They just don't like him. And messing with Aldhani's Holy Valley and attempting to affect their pilgrimage has without a doubt started to create dissent amongst the population. So even worse is the Imperials kind of feel superior to these Aldhanis. They even have, relatively racist views on them, despite the fact that they're all human beings. I mean, this makes no sense at all. I imagine had the Aldhani heist never happened, in a year or two, the Aldhani would most likely start revolting and attacking his forces, generally making his job harder. The real problem with Commandant Behaz's mentality and the mentality of many Imperial leaders is they're not forced to actually place the locals' best interests in their hearts. I mean, they don't really actually care, and I think the locals can totally sense this. The easiest course of action would have just been to respect local customs, build your military base far away from their holy site. I mean, heck, why not move the depository to the Alkanzi air base instead of the other way around? Things like an enterprise zone and creating medical facilities in the long run should win more and more of the local Aldhani over to your side, and it's a relatively simple process, I think, especially because you're talking about a planet that is extremely backwards and primitive and lacks these facilities. So if you can bring them value and worth, there's really no reason why the Aldhanis couldn't become good Imperial citizens. Again, all the Empire really had to do was just to move their airbase a little bit, and they would have had peace. And this is the Empire's problem. The leadership has never really cared about the plight of the average individual. Palpatine viewed people as assets, numbers on a spreadsheet that he can utilize to fulfill his goals. Pretty much the second he won total power and took over the Republic, he really stopped caring what the average person thought about. It's no wonder that the hearts and mind strategies carried out by the Empire are not very well thought out and very short-sighted. Sure, individual Imperial officers and sector commanders can generally have a good impact on local populations, but this was never a major concern or strategy adopted by Palpatine. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.